I think we'll get started. I am thrilled to see such a well-attended Zoom room. My name is Luke Stark. I am an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. So the place from which I'm speaking to you and the lands on which Western University is located are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Chinanton nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. The term "a dish with one spoon" refers to a concept developed by the indigenous peoples of North America's Great Lakes region. And it was used to describe how land can be shared to the mutual benefit of all its inhabitants. And so the dish with one spoon covenant wampum is quite literally a representation of a single dish that all of us here on Turtle Island, and especially here in the Great Lakes region, are asked to use fairly and justly and collectively. I think we have a long way to go to fulfill that request and honor that treaty. But so we respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land as their original caretakers. But many of you will likely be on different territories around the world and on Turtle Island or North America. And I invite you to offer your own land acknowledgements in the Zoom chat if possible. I also ask us to show respect for the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to these lands as their original caretakers, and to acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, endure in Canada and in other settler colonial territories. Recognizing these painful histories of genocide and forced removal, including those taking place at this time in history, I ask us to honor the Indigenous communities still living on and connected to these lands and circulating vibrantly on online spaces. We can do so by striving for restorative justice for Indigenous peoples and for those who have been marginalized and oppressed. I'll say a little bit more later on, but I first want to introduce Dr. Amanda Jibb, who is the 2025 to 2027 Rogers Chair, and who is, along with the Starling Center for Just Technologies and Just Societies, a co-sponsor of this wonderful event. So I'll turn it over to Mandy. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Luke. I'll keep it pretty short, but I just wanted to say a couple of words about the theme for the Rogers Chair this year and next year. As many of you know by now, we are focusing on media and the new fascism. And we've had a number of events and speakers dealing with issues related to AI and fascism, the rise of white supremacy, growing authoritarianism globally. And it's been, really wonderful to share virtual and in-person spaces with all of you to talk about these really important themes. We have one last event coming up after this one, and that is next Friday, March 27th, kind of happening in tandem with the Graduate Student Conference. So I encourage you to go to both events. This will be Threads That Unite Us Too. So this will be our second mass embroidery event. And the invitation is to come and embroider against fascism. We had our first event in October, and this second event we will be joined by visiting artist Sharmita Kaur from Montreal, and she will talk at 10 o'clock about mending or rafu in the Indian embroidery tradition. And it's a drop-in event, so 9:30 to 4:30 in the FIMS atrium. We will have all the supplies there that you need, and our objective is to finish the large tapestry of collaborative embroidery art against fascism. So I hope to see all of you next week, and really thrilled that Dan could join us today, and looking forward to this talk. And I'll turn it back over to Luke, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Mandy. As I said and Mandy said, we're delighted, we being the Rogers Chair and myself in representing the Starling Center for Just Technologies and Just Societies at Western University, to welcome virtually Dr. Dan McQuillan to speak on what has been an intriguing title to me all week: AI is a morbid symptom of the interregnum. Dr. McQuillan is senior lecturer in creative and social computing and critical AI at Goldsmiths, University of London. He's also a member of the UK's Economic and Social Research Council Centre for Socio-Digital Futures and the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council project Sustainable AI Futures. Dr. McQuillan holds degrees in physics and experimental particle physics from Oxford University and Imperial College London. But following his PhD, has worked in a variety of extremely worthy causes, including as a support worker for people with learning disabilities, as a mental health advocate, as the creator of a community-led website to provide translational information for asylum seekers, and as co-founder of citizen science projects in Kosovo and Kyrgyzstan. He has also worked for Britain's National Health Service and founded Amnesty International's first digital directorate. He has a long record of leadership in grassroots social movements, such as the campaign against the poll tax in the UK, in environmental activism, and as part of the international movement against the G7 in Genoa, calling for an alternative globalization that includes justice for both people and the planet. During the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, he also helped start a local mutual aid group where he lives in North London. He is the author of 2022's Resisting AI, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence, which was published by Bristol University Press. In a review for the International Journal of Communication, Florencio Cabello Fernandez Delgado wrote that Resisting AI represents, quote, a politically vigorous and intellectually rigorous confrontation with dangers that today are very certain, and that it, quote, masterfully disassembles AI as an epistemological, social, and political paradigm. I will say that I've always been struck by the intellectual breadth, generosity, and prescience of Dr. McQuillan's work. I think that his book was a kind of clarion call and warning that we, alas, didn't heed as much as we could have, and are now in some ways leaving with the consequences. So, with that in mind, I'm looking forward very much to hearing what he will say today. So, without further ado, Dan, please take it away.
Oh, well, yeah, talking of generosity, thanks very much for the generous introduction. I'm assuming the audio is working okay. Please let me know if it isn't. Yeah, and hello. Let me just start a stopwatch. The time doesn't get away. Yeah, first, I'd like to thank Luke and Amanda for the invitation to speak today. And a kind of disclaimer up front, I think elements of the talk might be a little bit densely argued and possibly use some jargon. But I hope it's going to spark some questions and discussion because that's really the bit I'm looking forward to. And especially because decomputing is really an idea in emergence. It's a developing idea, and I really want to engage in discourse about it. So yeah, the title of this talk, AI is a morbid symptom of the interregnum, which is a quote, as probably many people will realize, from Prison Notebooks of Antonio Gramsci. I think the full quote is, "The crisis consists in precisely the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." But before I get to that, I also want to be specific about what I mean by AI. Obviously, the term is an empty signifier in a lot of ways. It can mean whatever the speaker wants it to mean. So I'll tell you what I want it to mean, which is a specific mode of computation. When I'm talking about AI in its technical aspects, I'm talking about neural networks and transformer models. And when I'm referring to AI in general terms, I mean that and the associated logics, institutions, investments, and claims. And by the interregnum, I'm referring to the general usage of the term, a period of discontinuity and disruption between, in this case, different world orders. So I hope the slide just changed for you guys. So for me, AI is a set of contradictions. There's the trillions of whatever currency, dollars, pounds, whatever, in investment. There's all the technical activity. And now there's considerable geopolitical commitment from governments. On the other hand, it just can't deliver on its claims. At its core, this kind of AI is basically a bunch of correlations. It's pattern matching and now increasingly pattern generation. It does some very convincing simulations, but AI, whether it's predictive AI or generative AI, is fundamentally, I would argue, always faking it. It's also very reductive. So despite the current talk of, million token context windows, I think AI always removes the meaningful context, especially the kind of context that really underpins our social relations. So my starting question for the talk to myself was, what on earth is going on here? Why are we all being driven off the edge of a cliff in the name of a bullshit technology? So my answer would be that although AI isn't a powerful technology, it is the point at which a lot of powerful forces converge. So instead of scratching our heads about its internal contradictions, we should really ask what it actually aligns with and what it can tell us about the current historical moment. So AI is clearly a capitalist technology. Um, it enables employers to precarize workers, it channels venture capital to oligarchs, and it gives governments a way to claim that they're fixing services while continuing to neglect them. But I think AI also concentrates and amplifies many of the deep dualisms in our social structures. Not simply that, for example, image models are able to produce an endless supply of non-consensual porn, but that AI systematically devalues care, that its muscular approach of abstraction over context and optimization over care, matches the armored misogyny and masculinity which are so visibly on the rise in general. It's not simply that machine learning systems always pin accusations of welfare fraud on racial minorities, but that the core mechanism, which is segregation by similarity, repeats the mechanics of racism itself. AI's abstractive manipulations repeat the same distancing from the web of existence that capitalism uses to justify its planetary damage as simply an externality. So what I'm trying to say is that all the noise about so-called AI safety or X risk, existential risk, and the need to align AI with human values, it's all complete rubbish. Because AI already aligns with the values of racism, misogyny, and a contempt for nature. So paying attention to what's really going on with AI is a way to track the deeper realignments, as I would suggest hegemonic power struggles to deal with the collapse of the neoliberal world order and the unsettling of white patriarchal subjectivity. Rather than treating AI as the driver of change, we should see it as a morbid symptom of what we can expect from the underlying restructuring. AI isn't the arrival of superintelligence or a transcendent singularity. It's a technopolitics of the Interregnum, whose signs and portents include precaritization, militarization, and climate change. As I mentioned, AI precaritizes jobs because employers can threaten workers with the replacement by shoddy algorithmic substitutes, but it also precaritizes whole economies, as we can see with the current investment bubble. The large AI companies have been cozying up to the military-industrial complex for quite a while now, and we're seeing what that means in terms of actual conflict. The aspect of AI which sabotages its usefulness in social settings, which is its innate tendency to generate collateral damage through out-of-distribution errors and so-called hallucinations, ceases to be a problem where maximum indiscriminate damage is the actual point. Meanwhile, the push into generative AI has led the same companies who are getting military, it's led those same companies to publicly abandon their previous commitments to net zero. And they're doing that because they're locked onto a path of increasing model size, multiplying amounts of inference. And AI, so AI's impacts across the board are symptoms of a particular technopolitics, a faith in scaling and acceleration. With models, for example, we've gone from AlexNet back in the origins of this kind of this wave of AI, which had 60 million weights, to LLMs, which now have hundreds of billions of trainable parameters. I'd say that scaling is the industry's version of continuous growth. And like GDP, it has the same focus on sociopathic metrics that ignore any impact on social well-being. To my mind, AI is textbook accelerationism, a belief that we should go further and faster, that our tech should be overclocked to the point of meltdown in order to break through the barriers that are between us and some kind of new era. So despite AI's failure to actually be the next all-powerful technology, I think its scaling and its accelerationism are indicators to us of what are really more widespread nihilistic tactics being adopted by those who are desperate to hold on to power. Now, this scaling of AI is made most material, obviously, in the accelerating data center build-out. So this wave of data centers forcing residents to accommodate installations that stress electricity grids and deplete water tables, that double down on environmental injustice. It's sourcing now this is a visual example, sourcing gas turbines from shipbuilders to bypass the load balanced electricity backbone at the price of reckless methane emissions. AI infrastructure is increasingly manifesting as a low-intensity conflict against communities. Now, these concrete cathedrals of calculation, I was getting carried away with the illustrations there, reflect at the same time the mute compulsion of model size and the re-rendering of floating point operations as megawatts and gigawatts. We're at a stage now where boasts about energy consumption become a proxy for algorithmic power. The inexorable materiality that has been dragged into existence by dreams of AGI backpropagates through an imperial state capitalism that obsesses about supply chain control and rare earth minerals amidst the collapse of this so-called world order. And again, I'm trying to use AI to reflect back on the fact that its resource demands are really about the repositioning of these concentrated forms of power to maintain their control under rapidly changing conditions. What I think we've been seeing more recently is that AI is also a lens on the panic of domestic elites about their role in this new world order. The response we're increasingly seeing is calls for AI sovereignty, as if scattering flag-flying data centers over the homeland would fix AI's functional failings. To me, calls for AI sovereignty fall into line with the rest of the strident nationalisms and populisms which political classes everywhere seem to be falling back on in the face of the current polycrisis. I think the easy invocation of sovereignty by largely liberal policymakers unintentionally reveals a deeper contradiction in their claimed mission to deliver responsible AI. Because what AI has made increasingly visible, I think, is the aggressive, masculine, and supremacist culture incubated by big tech, a stance which it clearly and volubly shares with authoritarian politics. The patriarchal personhood that's trying to reclaim what it feels as its natural right is a type of autogenetic sovereignty, the self-production of an armored selfhood with no vulnerabilities or dependencies, and that deals with any challenge through an escalation of force. I imagine that description sounds somewhat familiar. So for me, the drive for AI sovereignty doesn't constrain the concentration of power, but actually confirms this reactionary shift in underlying psychopolitics. I'd suggest that what should most alarm us about the generalized embrace of AI is the direction of travel it indicates, which I think is towards increasingly authoritarian and fascistic solutionism. Arguments, if this is the case, then arguments based on reason, that AI systems don't work properly or identify the wrong people, completely lack traction because cruelty is increasingly becoming the point. Under conditions of crisis or collapse, the threatened subject doesn't hope for salvation as such, but merely wishes to see the other suffer more than them. The most widespread use of machine learning, and now AI, by governments in Europe, anyway, has been to generate accusations of welfare fraud that stigmatize refugee communities. And it's similar allegations that legitimized deploying ICE into the Somali communities of Minneapolis, where subsequently Palantir's AI tools entangled any opposition in the paranoid correlations of a murderous security state. The technological apparatus of AI, because of its many failings, is more or less useless for social reproduction. But it has some very attractive features for those who desire a machinery for mass deportation. AI, I think, also sheds light on the morbid belief systems that circulate in heightened forms during an interregnum. In our case, it's the eschatologies of transhumanism and long-termism, which are essentially florid forms of a more diffuse accelerationism, which also resides in apparently respectable policy spaces. And these kind of beliefs always carry with them eugenicist predispositions about who should be considered disposable on the path to technocratic redemption. The alienation from our own agency that's scaled by AI rests on this disempowerment that's delivered by our existing structures. The state form itself relies on a secularized form of sacred authority handed down by the Enlightenment, which makes resisting the transcendent power of tech by appealing to the transcendent power of the state, to my mind, yet another nested contradiction. The repeated liberal refrain that the only reasonable response to the threat of AI is to rely on established forms of governance is already a very visible failure and will continue to be so. AI is, in a very fundamental sense, Epstein tech. Not simply because the guy himself was intertwined with it for decades. If you look at the photos that have emerged recently, he pops up in company with everyone from Marvin Minsky to Zuckerberg and Musk, of course, and Thiel. But it's not just because of these individual networkings of power. It's because the apparatus of AI is a concentrated network of masculine power, which enables abuse at scale. AI extends a misogynist power, and so will whatever tech comes after it, unless we find ways to radically reinvent our approach to technopolitics. If AI is a diagnostic of systemic crisis and restructuring, which is what I'm trying to argue, then the idea of decomputing, which is an idea in emergence, is trying to articulate an alternative. And the lineaments of this alternative that I'm going to try to articulate, I suppose, are degrowth, deautomatization, care, and conviviality. So AI itself, as currently exists, is a form of futuring, whose claims to inevitability try to bring dystopia into the present. So decomputing tries to be a prefigurative tactic, a technopolitics of the here and now that's consistent with preferred futures and attempts to iterate towards them. If, as I've already argued, AI's runaway scaling is the latest instance of a centuries-long commitment to boundless extractivism, as in a way was kind of alluded to by the land acknowledgement, then a central goal of degrowth is to remove this systemic drive for imperial expansion. Rather than, as the critics often say, it's some kind of call for austerity, which it isn't, because after all, that's what we've already got from our current concentrations of wealth and power. It's actually a pretty modest set of minimum demands for a reduced throughput of energy and resources and an expansion of social justice. I mean, I think they're modest. The computational corollary of degrowth is already a kind of active area of research, and it has many names: frugal computing, computing within limits, permacomputing. So the aim of this broader idea of decomputing is to combine this with a destituent approach to political power. So that's an approach that denies legitimacy to any form of order based on automatization. The one we've got, or propose alternatives that really rely underneath on the same automatizations. So a key pillar of decomputing, as well as the idea of degrowth, is de-automatization, which I admit is the not catchiest term that one could ever come up with. But what I'm alluding to with de-automatization is a recognition that AI's normative effect on the conditions of thought reduces the capacity for autonomy. And simply altering our applications of algorithms won't remove the thoughtlessness and hierarchical binaries that underpin them. So if we're going to change things, if we're going to change our tech, we also need to do that in ways that tackle its fusion with microsocial violence and institutional numbness. So that's why decomputing encourages assemblies, forms of assembly, like workers' and people's councils. Because the pitch there is that peer-to-peer relationships and directly democratic processes at least have some potential for de-automatization. That collective struggle under conditions of consensus and trust is a way to push back against our repetition of inherited social patterns. And that the act of care is the antithesis of that armored subjectivity I was talking about, because it rehumanizes us for each other and creates the preconditions for empathy. Care is critical here, really, because it underpins the possibility of an alternative restructuring. Because the activity of care, the activity of sustaining bodies, cells, and environments, as part of a complex ecological and social web, is the alternative underpinning to the alienations of the current order. And the aim of workers' and people's councils or other assembly forms as part of decomputing is about caring for each other and caring about the future at the same time. So I was a little bit stuck for a slide for convivial technology, and I couldn't really think of anything more convivial for me than a coffee machine. Decomputing draws on this idea of conviviality, as originally espoused at least by Ivan Illich, which treats all tools as an inseparable blend, possibly another coffee reference, a blend of mechanism and social values. It also draws on recent iterations of those ideas, which connect more directly to degrowth, such as the matrix of convivial technologies. So Illich's stated purpose in Tools for Conviviality was to lay down criteria by which the manipulation of people for the sake of their tools can be immediately recognized. And I think we can immediately recognize in that a description of the functioning of AI as we currently know it. So decomputing is seeking to develop convivial tools that close down the potential for fascistic application and open up affordances for more sustainable futures. Decomputing, I'll admit, or at least maybe I'll advocate, is less of a program or a set of steps and more of a framework for escalation. Hyperscale data centers, for example, clearly fail any assessment of conviviality. So refusing them is a way of resisting the endless growth agenda. But resisting data centers can also be an opportunity for what I might call infrastructural intersectionality. Opposing these material structures because they also drive overlapping social harms, like the algorithmic exploitation in Amazon warehouses, in gig work, the outsourced data labor, as well as the AI-powered targeting for welfare sanctions or deportation. I'm suggesting that political solidarity in the face of these intersecting AI harms are the conditions from which self-organized assemblies like people's councils can orient towards more systemic transformations. This is Stafford Beer's viable systems model for anybody who's into that kind of thing. It's not simply that data centers are expropriating energy and water, but that privatized neoliberal utilities are happy to play along. It's not simply that big tech can claim control over life-giving resources, but that governments obsessed with GDP growth are willing to let them do it. And believe me, that rings so true here in the UK. To decomputing, the question posed by data centers isn't just to interrupt these expropriations, but to aim for the resocialization of all of society's energy and water resources, and the development of technologies that can help infrastructure this return to the common good. Because, and this is kind of the reference to the VSM, mutual and layered governance at local, regional, and even international level is not only conceivable, but considerably less complex than the tech we're currently placing our trust in to solve all of our existing problems. And it's considerably more grounded than any delusions of machine intelligence. So, prefigurative strategies, like decomputing, are a deliberate turn away from the idea that scale determines significance. So decomputing would embrace examples like Casa Pueblo, set up after the state abandonment of the people of Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Casa Pueblo is community-level solar energy co-ops. So decomputing would welcome self-organized infrastructures of care like those set up by Occupy Sandy in a similarly storm-stricken New York, whose operations of mutual aid and solidarity not only distributed aid, but unlike the reluctant and racist state responses, treated people in need as peers. The help provided by Occupy Sandy wasn't dependent on any attempt to classify or rank people according to algorithmic boundaries of deserving or undeserving, this computational modernization of Victorian morality, or to assess their eligibility according to some digitized criteria of citizenship, the AI haunted by the ghost of Carl Schmitt. The distributed effect of decomputing, in fact, is to deactivate existing apparatuses of computational power and return to common use the technical means for making our own arrangements. A refusal of AI is a forensic approach to finding out what has already gone wrong in any situation where AI is proposed as a solution. Closely examining that context will reveal reductive quantifications and relational automatisms that have decimated the situation already. You can see this in the technocratic metricization of education, where I work, or in the austerity-driven triage of social provision pretty much everywhere. And decomputing is the call to re-establish the primacy of relationship and reciprocity in any of these settings. The logic of the assembly, I would suggest history shows us, emerges when people realize they can't rely on whatever institution or sovereign force is currently claiming legitimacy. And I suggest that this time right now is very ripe for experiments in structured mutuality, because existing forms of hegemonic authority are leaking credibility faster than new forms of computational distraction can be produced, although they are produced very quickly. AI isn't inevitable, you may be relieved to hear. But there's no going back to a pre-AI status quo, because our systems were already structured on injustice and heading for planetary burnout. Rather than ruining democratic accountability, what AI has simply highlighted is the cruelties that were already built in. And AI's inability to manifest the claims made about it shed a rather unforgiving light on the way the rest of our systems were already failing to deliver. We should resist AI, not just because it's harmful in its own right, but because it's part of a nihilistic attempt to hold on to power by the same forces that created the crisis in the first place. What AI shows us is that a reductive and preemptive epistemology is a very poor foundation for a more caring world. And it shows us that the technopolitics of power will continue to produce mechanisms for defining who can be regarded as disposable. I'd say, having spent probably too long mulling all this over, I'd say that the real energy source behind AI infrastructure isn't gas turbines, or even the fantasies about nuclear fusion which are doing the rounds. It's fear. The techno-patriarchy everywhere fears the loss of unquestioned mastery. Better to accelerate the burn than admit fragility or allow the rest of us to have a real say in the conditions of our own existence. I'm not in any way claiming that the practices of decomputing, whatever they turn out to be, would be sufficient to challenge the totality of this contemporary nihilism. But they are one starting point for constructing systems that recognize and celebrate our mutual vulnerability. Challenging the way the abstract models of AI perpetuate authoritarian social relationships should lead us to question the structures that produced them in the first place. AI is the contradiction that sheds light on many other contradictions, especially on the divergence between existing claims to legitimacy and the reality of destructive violence. I wrote those lines a little while ago and it seems ever truer by the day. Decomputing points to a post-sovereign technopolitics that rebuilds legitimacy through mechanisms like solidarity and mutual aid, and the development of material mechanisms for situated survivability and sustainable ecological relations. That's it. Thanks very much.
I fear that our audience does not have access to the tiny applause button, but I'll channel their undoubted applause to thank you so much, Dan, for that incredible talk. So the audience, you should now have access to the Q&A. And so if you have questions, please do type those in, and Mandy and I will mediate those and bring them to Dan. Um, so while we're waiting for audience questions, I have one, and maybe Mandy, you have one afterwards too. Um, One question that I have is about an insight that Michel Foucault evinces in his work on biopolitics and its connection to classification, which is to say that, at the end, he at the end of this has always struck me about this famous essay or lecture. Actually, he sort of says, there's a kind of real through line between wanting to order the world, wanting to classify the world, which of course is what AI is doing, and fascism, and he points it out very clearly. But then he also says, socialist regimes or socialist states in the style, I suppose, of the 1970s Soviet Union and other things have the same problem about classification. And so I'm I take it in your formulation of a kind of post sovereign politics that this is neither of these models. This is something totally different. How do you see the role of enumerating and classifying in that space, if at all? Because, I mean, humans love to put things into categories, right? And they have, that's a kind of human trait. And so that to me seems like something that has always has the potential to put us down these very dark roads. And I wonder what if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, they may not be the most worked up thoughts, but I
Well,
think, yeah, no, no, I mean, I'm a former scientist, and I say that not because I've abandoned science. It's like really, really important activity, and at least science with a small s, maybe. What I turned against, actually, you know, partly as a result of doing my PhD, was science with a capital S, which I think is relevant to your point because that
Mm,
was a actually quite supremacist fetishization of quantification and mathematization, actually, as the sort of ultimate source of knowledge, and everything else being sort of derivative and rather secondary. I mean, it's a very weird culture, and
mm,
you know, high energy physics or fundamental particle physics, and in a weird kind of way, in the same way that actually doing that maths gave me an insight to what was going on under the hood with AI. Actually, thinking about it now, hanging around with those people gave me a rather uncomfortable insight into, some of the culture in the sort of tech bro sphere. And the reason I mention all those things is because I don't think, counting stuff, categorizing stuff, calculating stuff like a bad thing per se. It should be somehow outlawed. I think it's really how these things are elevated and considered as sort of epistemically superior to to lived experience, to contingent discourse, to at the end of the day, the fact that life is extremely complicated and largely unknowable in many dimensions, and there's a constant process of us together trying to understand what's the best thing to do at any given moment. And I think any claim to override that, really, any claim to override that participatory, messy, complex situation that we're all
mm,
plunged into, that we should consider ourselves to be very much part of. I mean, that's what I understand, as an England outsider, very much from the epistemologies of the people who your land acknowledgement referred to, saw themselves as participants in this complex and relatable and reciprocal world. Any attempts to usurp that by some kind of essentially top-down idea of politics or knowledge or whatever it is, really, to me is, you know, probably not going to end well.
thank you. Mandy, do you have any questions, or should we turn it over to shall we go to the chat?
No, I think we have four questions in the chat. So I was thinking, Luke, maybe you could take Dyer Witherford's and Berkman's questions together. If you want to read them out, I think they're
Sure. Yeah, they're quite
similar.
related. That's right. Yeah. So Nick Dyer Witherford, our FIMS colleague, says, Dan, I enjoyed your talk, admire your work, and agree with your analysis of AI fascism. However, I think you failed to adequately recognize the contradictory tendencies of capital, which releases powers it cannot fully command and indeed inadvertently subverts it. In an interregnum, these contradictions become salient. Given that AI can A, reduce tedious and harmful work, B, assist in collaborative collective planning, and C, flows from the general intellect, and D, is an intriguingly weird expansion of human capacities, why foreclose on the possibilities of its use in a new solar energy-driven, digitally distributed computational communism? That's Nick. And then the related question, can you imagine that the pattern matching correlation methods of AI and big data could be a net positive if applied under a different and more benevolent, sustainable oriented political system used for positive social purposes?
Yeah, great questions. Oh, thanks very much. Yeah. So now my chat's moving in. I need to keep track of the questions.
Oh,
Um,
sorry.
yeah, it's okay. Uh, so I basically don't think that AI is doing anything actually very useful. So I don't, if I understand Nick's question, and my apologies if I misunderstand. It's as you can see from the darkening room, it's getting a bit late here, and it's been a long week. So, but if I do understand the question correctly, to me, it would allude to what I think is, an understandable and quite commonly shared position that there is something in AI and that we should reclaim it as a technology for positive social purposes, even for the common good. And that there's a main drawback with it is that it's controlled by the people it's controlled, built by the people it's built by. To which I'd say is like, that's a fair starting point, and really the purpose of the matrix of cognitive technologies, for example, is to try to assess any technology for the sort of innate tendencies it has sedimented from the conditions of its production, and to consider how applicable or undesirable those are in an altered context, in a more socialized context. So for me, and I've spent, as I often think to myself, far too long paying attention to AI. I think it's basically rubbish. I mean, really. I mean, this is why, I'm started the talk for the question I posed to myself was, what's going on here? Really, what is going on? This technology is nonsense. It doesn't, uh, if I can recall the comments there in the question, to me, it doesn't remove tedious work. It mystifies it because it simulates the removal of tedious work and actually builds up, for example, in my own area, I'd say, in not my own area, but I am in a school of computing, in the area of coding even, I think it's actually building up a sort of subliminal level of technical debt that we're all going to live to regret. But it's much more obvious socially. It doesn't summarize things. It simulates summaries of them. I don't see that as like saving anything. Most careful studies, for example, I'm just picking on summarization as something that's coming to my head as a potential time-saving application of AI, maybe even in intellectual context. It doesn't do that. It simulates that. And in simulating it, for example, it very often removes the most important part of it. And I think this applies to all of the, unfortunately, applies to all of the potentially socially positive applications of AI, such as, forms of inclusion. I have really honestly tried to pay attention to the area of AI and disability because I think it's really important. And, I don't want to fall back on simple sayings. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater or whatever it is. And actual fact, disability is a good point to settle on in a way, because I do think that it perhaps leads to the second question as well. I do think that the most fundamental characteristic of AI as it currently exists to me is that it so strongly resonates with the mathematical origins of the processes that go on inside, which are essentially eugenics. The logistic regression that really is at the heart of these correlations was developed by Carl Pearson under the tutelage of Galton to explicitly, mathematically, scientifically justify, the racial superiority of, in that case, the British Empire, and justify its control over them. Again, the kind of territories, the territorial acknowledgement at the beginning of the talk. I'm not saying that we should throw in the same way that I was trying to allude earlier on about assessing technologies. I'm not saying, or that I was saying about science. I'm not saying chuck logistic regression in the bin. But to my mind, uh, this AI is an unequivocally weaponized um, development of those techniques that is entirely, you talked about the through line, entirely in a through line from its original developments. So I'm not saying that something called AI wouldn't necessarily be developed by or useful for a society that was more socialized, more social, more feminist, more decolonial. But I can't see it with this kind of AI. It doesn't do it. It's basically crap. And that's the interesting thing. What is it about a crap technology? It's basically crap. It doesn't do it. It does do damage, which is why it's great for warfare. And it does do damage in social context because it doesn't do what it claims to do. So, yeah, I find that the interesting contradiction. And I've temporarily lost the full elements of the second question. Do you have them to hand?
So the second question was, yeah, can you imagine that the pattern matching correlation methods of
Oh,
AI and
yeah.
big data could be a net positive?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, again, really, back to actually our original conversation about, or at least the ideas I was dropping around science. And I'm not sort of, I wouldn't rule out anything in a lot of ways. I wouldn't rule out pattern matching. I wouldn't rule out correlation. I am a bit suspicious actually of the idea of big data because I think data, going back to your question, Luke, the role, scope, and significance of um, really relying on datafication as a way to deal with the world, I think really has been questioned, but really deserves to be continually questioned, in our social arrangements. And so big data, I'm not so sure about actually. I think that is
Hmm.
really contain many problems. But the idea of correlation data and so forth, I think inevitably it will have some role in, and then there's nothing, there's no, I can't conceive of an alternative world that doesn't also come with, a mixture of upsides and downsides and damages and have to be balanced with benefits and so forth. But I can equivocally say, you know, from my experience, my understanding, that this technology should be chucked into the bin.
So, unsurprisingly for us, for this audience, we have a number of detailed and thoughtful questions of all kinds. I'm going to take three. My colleague Alyssa Santivani says, "Thank you for this excellent talk. My question is whether or how you see us moving towards degrowth, de-automatization, care, and conviviality. Are these fundamentally grassroots, bottom-up movements? Are there that you can see engaging these forms of change across levels of organization from individual group scale to state level efforts?" Likewise, Alison Hearn, my colleague, says again, thank you for this great reading. I'm fascinated about decomputing as a form of resistance or alternative practice. Can you describe some specific forms of decomputing we can undertake in our daily lives that might make a difference? And given the hyper-personalized forms of subjectivization operating in and through our digital lives, do you have any suggestions for building collectivities outside of disaster or trauma? And then finally, Ezra Tabul writes, thank you, this is fantastic. I was hoping you might be able to elaborate on decomputing and its potential to building a shared and distributed culture of accountability that includes techniques and technologies. The British Crown's militaristic reaction to the Luddites, according to Ezra, kicked off over 200 years of a profound alliance between the state and capital that curtailed technological refusal at every turn, from the Luddites weaving frames to Cynthia Cockburn-Coburn's typesetting churches to AI. How might decomputing break down, wither away perhaps, public-private unaccountability in abuses of power? So, just some minor questions. Just lay out a whole theory of how
Yeah.
to get to decomputing.
Well, wow, where to start? So, I mean, I guess I've got an automatic cop-out clause, which is that the very point of the kind of things I'm arguing for is to really sidestep or withdraw from totalizing theories of anything and totalizing
Mm,
programs for social change. Um, I think the sort of balance to be struck in any situation between because I do think having programs of action is really important, and I don't sort of seek to set them out. I guess what I'm trying to say is really starting from a very specific standpoint, which is that of the question of AI and the question of technology in a broader technopolitics. To start from, well, very simply to start from a point of insisting on a resistance to AI, and an immediate exploration of alternative configurations of technology and politics. So, and that's why, in my, um, I guess my attention to that stuff, it has become more visible to me that that activity really is just entirely aligned with ideas, for example, around degrowth. That actually, as I was trying to say in the talk, the scaling that's such a sort of symptom, and this is really what the talk is kind of about in a way. It's really sort of seeing AI as a set of symptoms or symptomatic, as in the title actually, of a broader state of things. So the scaling is symptomatic of something that's very, very deeply embedded in and just repeating and iterating on the concepts of growth that
Mm.
drive imperial expansion. So I guess in a way, um, I guess what I'd be aspiring to really, and I think this is more the kind of thing I've encountered on a on the level of discourse with people approaching those ideas from different directions, is just that at the moment, for example, the thinking around how to tackle specifically technology in general, but definitely computational technology isn't so developed in those particular spheres. There's plenty of people doing amazing stuff about degrowth, and I'm a student of that, in an inadequate one, but both in that and in the climate movement, which I'm more immediately familiar with, there's a kind of that there's not a there's not a confidence when dealing with this kind of technology, in as much as it being uh, the manifestation of things that people of concepts and dynamics and politics that people are actually quite familiar with and understand how to tackle. They're not confident or even necessarily addressing how to deal with things like AI in the same way. I mean, now with the struggle around data centers, that's changed somewhat. But I think rather than me spinning out from decomputing only and saying, and this sort of expands to a larger theory of degrowth and decoloniality and totalizing social change, it's more about welcoming the fact that those are already movements and ideas that are active in the world and trying to equip maybe those movements with the necessary means to deal with things like AI and whatever comes after it or whatever exists around it. Um, yeah, so I'm sorry, I have no way of retaining all the questions, but I'm going to like pick up on random things I can remember. In terms of sort of manifesting what that actually means, again, um, I think that's really why I put in this idea of AI as a symptom of something already going wrong. I mean, it does seem to me a pretty good heuristic, actually, a pretty good rule of thumb that wherever someone or some entity is enthusiastically or even in some ways aggressively pushing people to adopt AI, it's a pH test of there being certain kinds of things actually, not just things being wrong, but certain kinds of things being wrong in the existing situation. So that's the interesting part about decomputing and the sort of non-linear part, because it's not there's not a universal, again, consistently, there's not a universalizable method here. What it's saying is that any of these contingent situations, any of these given contexts, which in themselves should inevitably be complex and intersubjective, you know, have been decimated by uh, other forces which sort of have now come to fruition with AI. And AI is a problem, and it will make things worse, but it's not the problem, or it's not the underlying problems. So the task then becomes, and I think for some of us in the room anyway, higher education would be like a starting point for that. Higher education, it's pretty clear to anybody who has been in it for a while and pays attention to the condition of it, has been under attack essentially for a long time and has been undermined for a long time. The very idea of education, certainly the very idea of critical education, has been the enemy within for a long time and has been undermined by mechanisms of league tables and metricizations of various kinds and financialization, whatever else it is. You know, so the question of decomputing, I am trying to start with the technical and say, I do think the future has a technical dimension. And then I am interested in the same way that one of the earlier questions, I'm really interested in what it is, if anything, that computing can do in alternative and more autonomous uh, forms of dealing with any of the things that we need to deal with and arranging any of the things we need to have and the institutions the social functions that we want. I really am interested in that. In fact, and whether computing has any role to play, actually. Um, but I don't think that, so there isn't one single formula there, except the one that I am trying to advocate is the necessity for corresponding forms of social organization, which are not the ones that we are most currently familiar with, because I'm pretty sure that any of us who are currently employed are working in certain kinds of institution that people have been correctly identifying since at least the Second World War as being in themselves contributing and incubating the kind of things that break out in times like this as the mechanisms for authoritarian, if not eugenicist, activities. So the institutionalization, the thoughtlessness that Hannah Arendt referred to is definitely a characteristic that we need to evade and withdraw from, and therefore need to come up with alternative forms of social arrangement. Now, it's not that those never existed or never exist. I mean, very regrettably, I think really, really sadly and tragically, one of the most operational manifestations of that recently was the democratic administration of northeast Syria, aka Rojava. That really was attempting to practice at least some different levels of civic administration, that attempted some aspects of feminist and sort of autonomous organization of the needs of everyday life. It's currently been, there's a current attempt to erase it, but it's not the only one. These things continually try to bubble up, and there's plenty of history. Again, the question about the Luddites, which the question itself I've temporarily lost track of, you can remind me now, is a good example. So what was the question about the Luddites again?
Well, the question I think was along the lines of asking about decomputing and its the kind of how it builds a shared and distributed culture of accountability.
Yeah, I mean, accountability is a great one. I think I don't know. For me, the term legitimacy is a lot, and it's a bit simplistic, but I guess the sort of rule of thumb again that I have in my head is that there was that moment, that historical moment particularly in sort of British political social history, if you like, where the post-Luddite turn, if you like, was towards Chartism, was towards representational politics as a means of, gaining a degree of social justice and better distribution of resources and so forth. And I think there is something, I did argue this a bit in Resisting AI, there is something about representational forms that should I think, be treated with um, quite a high degree of caution
Hmm.
in terms of the kind of mechanisms that can actually deliver for the common good. And so basically, I think it was, I mean, I'm going to sit here in my bedroom pointing the finger at the Chartists, but I think that was probably a wrong turn, and that the Luddites had a better idea because they said you can't extract politics from technology or vice versa.
I'm aware that one of the downsides of the webinar format is the only voice you hear is mine, which I get tired of myself. But I'll read the next question from Kay Roth, who identifies as a computer science PhD student and says that they highly relate to what you described of your own PhD. In trying to envision decomputing software, they write, I find myself identifying a tension between building convivial software and building on the existing socio-technical stack of what's already there. And their fear is that software that rejects the stack won't be found useful, while a software that builds on the stack won't be radical. What theoretical insights on decomputing could you provide to guide their work there?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's that seems like the kind of dilemma that you can't sort of solve from that position. You know, it's definitely amazingly positive to recognize the contradiction, and I think in some ways, I find it fairly infuriating the talk about stacks at the moment, because certainly here, or in our sort of near neighboring continent, there's a lot of talk about the Euro stack, and digital sovereignty and all this kind of thing, and it's really well, it's infuriating for a reason that I tried to lay out, at least in the talk, somewhat. You know, um, what was I trying to think of there? Yeah, so I think it's good to reckon these are the kind of dilemmas you have to recognize without being able to solve them per se. And I think it's maybe trying to situate that dilemma within the wider dilemmas. It's not just about what software you're developing. It's who you're developing it with and under what context, because it's the socio-technical aspect that needs to be sort of tackled in a in a holistic way. Uh, and I mean, I don't think there's any easy solution to this, because and I was saying a few minutes ago, in as an aside, really, my own wonder about how much computing has a role to play in the future, really, because if you really dig into this stuff, and this is what is kind of weirdly revealing about the current moment, I think, is that we're sort of being forced to face up to re-examine, everything about computing, going all the way back to the mineral lines, that and the other end of it, the waste end of things, in the same way that I mean, it's also self-referential at the moment. I mean, the whole thing about the energy dilemma of AI has reinvigorated the debate around nuclear power, which itself, is it's inconceivable to really think about that in the way that we're being encouraged to think about it, which is entirely narrowly and completely ignoring both of those ends of it. Where does the stuff come from in the first place, and what damage is done, and where does it go to afterwards? I mean, maybe this is the perspective really to be thinking of, rather than thinking of computing as a thing. This is a bit like sort of trying to have a practical application of process philosophy. It's looking at the thing as computing as a sort of transient, uh, a momentary sedimentation in a larger set of flows, and it's these flows that we're trying to reorient. So there's no easy answer, but it's trying to say, okay, how do I navigate these flows in a way? How do I navigate these flows of resource, these flows of rare earth minerals, these flows of manufacturing processes, which themselves tie to, the stuttering flows of sort of global trade and relations at the moment, and what is the flow form? I'm probably completely tripping now. But what is the kind of flow form that we would prefer, that would provide a greater form of well-being for us individually and planetarily? How do we arrange those things? I don't think it's that we're going to necessarily stop digging things out of the ground and making things out of them. It's not necessarily the case that we're going to stop calculating things or trying to automate certain things. I'm pretty keen on certain kinds of automation myself. It's I think it's trying to situate our struggles within that bigger picture, and most importantly, with others. It's not something to be carried alone there's no way to break through this with the force of activity or intellect or um, or programming or anything else. It's not a thing to do that way. It's an unknown. But it is something to be worked towards, and that's why I try to emphasize with this idea of decomputing, not saying this is well worked out idea, the idea of iteration. That's really goes with the concept of a sort of prefigurative technopolitics. We don't know. We can't know. That's the whole point. We can't know because we even aren't the people who can know that. Our subjectivities are entirely uh, warped, shaped by the conditions that we are currently in. So it's only by the activity of actually trying to shift those conditions that we can, in a way, enact some of those shifts, you know, in and of ourselves, so that we can get to position to the answer the next question and take up the next contradiction. Yeah, it's probably enough my wittering.
I'm aware that the hour goes late in the UK, and indeed that the hour of Minerva flies at dusk. I hope you could maybe a couple more questions if that's okay,
No,
Dan,
sure.
and
Yeah.
then we'll wrap it up. Our colleague Lisa Henderson, Emeritus Dean of FIMS, writes her thanks indeed from the car in the way to a care appointment for an elderly family member, and her question is about care. She writes, I appreciate the frame of decomputing to use our technical resources for meeting our needs, but could you complicate the idea of care? This was actually a question that I had as well. It has a
Mm.
promising but also immiserating history, especially for some delivery systems and labor groups. How can we use it openly and sustainably as possible?
Yeah. I mean, that's a totally fair critique, I think, of, casually deploying the term care, because care can be, punitive. Care can be, you know, a part of these constraining structures, which, I'm trying to um, advocate ways to withdraw from. And so I think we have to be careful in the same way that I try to be careful with the definition of AI, so I don't get caught in
Mm.
it could be anything you want it to be. We have to be careful in the definition of care. And I guess, I suppose one of the helpful heuristics in what I'm trying to talk about with care is its reciprocity. That care has to be has to involve mutuality in some sense. So that means that tries to mitigate against its, deployment as power over. And I think, again, I was trying to throw in, I threw in those examples of things that happened under what you might call humanitarian conditions for a couple of reasons. One is because they do, at least temporarily, escape from the established ways of doing things. But because, for example, I do think in Occupy Sandy and other things like that, there are, there is the, if you like, the prototyping of forms of care that don't involve power over, that do come from, I think, actually, a fairly intuitive uh, understanding that, which was something that I, tried to argue in the slightly more philosophical parts of resisting AI, that we are really fundamentally not actually separate. We really are co-constitute each other in some really important way. But, but, oh, and the other reason, I guess, why I found those humanitarian examples, or, those kind of crisis examples so relevant is because, in my darker moments, I am actually fairly convinced that we are heading for various forms of breakdown. It doesn't seem like a crazy thing to say, does it, right now? That actually we will be facing up to these questions collectively anyway, whether we like it or not. And my reading of history, just to go off on a bit of a, hope it's not a rabbit hole, my understanding anyway, at least, is that in situations where things have manifested more positively, it's generally because there was a lot of prep work done beforehand. When the basically when the shit hits the fan, in those contexts where a number of people have done the political and practical work to prepare some concepts and practice of alternatives, then that may actually get to flourish. And so the work of that preparation, which I guess really is also what I see as decomputing being part of, becomes really urgent. Again, not necessarily at scale, but definitely in a distributed way, because I think we're really going to need it. And maybe we're going to need it even sooner than we think. So, I think that's really all I've got to say about the care thing. I do, understand that care is an extremely complicated concept, and I didn't do it in any way justice. I can only say that I'm involved in some, several kind of lifelong iterations of care myself, and it is in a way the kind of area where we constantly have to address the complexity of the role in which that care is playing and the power relations which it brings about and the suffering actually that's involved.
I think we're going to take two more questions. The first from Daniel Aros Nunez, one of FIMS doctoral students. Also, thanks for the talk and with many rich ideas. Um, he wants to ask a clarifying question of how, under the framework of resisting and support AI and supporting degrowth, how much the language of AI's psychological or physiological or health effects also often uses the language of degeneration. For example, public critiques of AI use in social media have seemed to latch onto terms like brain rot. How would you propose we talk about AI's effects on the body, and how can that be utilized in a more productive critique of AI? I think this kind of maybe gets back to the kind of the point about disability and some of these questions too.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I really like the idea of considering the sort of somatic, dimension of AI. It's clearly, it's clearly a match dropped onto petrol in terms of the sort of mental health context more broadly. The vulnerability and precarity of people individually, but also in a sense, in a kind of society-wide sense, in some fundamental way, and it's open to our interpretation how much that's also a reflection of the crisis times we're living in and the people's expectations or lack of expectations about the future. AI is a conflagration that way. The effects it's immediately having, and it's very obviously. Um, the bodily effects aren't something that I've considered so much, and I think that's a really interesting question. And I guess what that would allude to really is the idea of, and I think you're right. I'm not sort of trying to ignore the point about care and disability. In fact, I think this actually might kind of segue to it really strongly in ways that I might not be able to completely articulate myself right now. That I guess the immediate thing there. I mean, I don't like terms like brain rot personally because I also have a problem with the whole kind of minds and brains thing and brains as sort of that doesn't really escape the idea of brains as forms of computational substrate. you know, uh, that whole computationalism perspective on consciousness and thought, I steer clear of most of the time because I'm not really interested in those debates. They're fine. I just don't think that's anything to do with what AI is actually about. But what I do think is that it's really interesting, especially on the semantic side, to consider the um, perhaps the weaponized normativity of AI in general and its intensification of the idea which again, or the intensification of the effect, which again is not AI's unique contribution, but it does really, I think it does kind of double down on it again, of intensifying who is not able and who is to be excluded for whatever reason, who is no longer productive. And there is something really interesting in, I find in, which I haven't been able to express properly, so I doubt I'm going to be able to do that now, but in the whole energy focus and fetish around AI at the moment. It's not just a fetish, it's a very material effect, but the whole centrality of energy as a feature of AI, or rather AI as a question of energy, AI as something that's kind of fused with the energy industry in some kind of important way. And the roots of some of our thinking around energy and energetics in general, the roots of energy and the ideas of efficiency as developed by sort of a, largely Protestant scientific clique in Scotland in, whatever the late 19th century, that those ideas of efficiency and productivity and waste, I think are carry over in some way that we should track into what AI is doing and what AI is intensifying right now. And these all have implications for bodies, I think, and the experience of bodies. And I'm actually trying to get around to writing something myself, which may possibly give me a chance to articulate this properly. But I do carry the strong sense that even the concept of disability and certainly and this is a positive, again, that the things that uh, disability activists and disability tech activists, if you like, uh, kind of crip techniques and the different explorations that people in the disability scene have made around technology as a way of challenging the whole um, imposition of status quo ideas about disability as a whole almost certainly are a really strong doorway to what kind of thing decomputing could actually mean. That's all I got right now.
Um, that's pretty good for for off the cuff. So I'll give one final question from Zachariah Rupp, who identifies as a member, owner, and founder of a worker-owned cooperative focused on evaluating the epistemic integrity of conversational AI. And they say, you said that AI is not inevitable, but I fear that the economies at play are so large that we've got very little power to resist that inevitability. He says, you also note that the time is right for cooperative structures to emerge in opposition to the capital incentives that undermine individuals being exploited and disenfranchised. So the question is, should the forced inevitability of this technology actually materialize? What cooperative actions do you think must necessarily follow to ensure we do not fall into the fascist trap?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I say AI isn't inevitable, I mean it. But I mean it in the sense, capitalism isn't inevitable. But it certainly has been pretty
Mm,
tenacious, and
mm.
it's the thing that we exist in. I just don't, my contribution would be to carry on insisting that it's not inevitable and to carry on trying to articulate the idea that there should be alternatives. Now, I'm not here to sort of diss anybody's attempts to mitigate stuff. I think mitigation is really important. Um, any minimization of harms is a good thing. And so making the implementation of AI under any context a bit less shit is not a bad thing. Um, it isn't necessarily the same thing as the things that I'm trying to promote or advocate for. And I think I am trying to argue for the fact that um, I guess what I try to riff on there, when I try to do that sort of politician thing of switching to a topic I'd like to talk about, what I'd like to riff on there is the idea of what's a reasonable response to this stuff, because you might say, I'm not saying this is what the questioner was saying, but you might say it's all very well to sit there and go, yeah, it's not inevitable, but actually it's all around us. We've got to deal with it. How do we make it less bad? And I guess what I'm really arguing is that this isn't a time to be reasonable, actually. I think, you know, reasonable is no defense against I would say what's coming, but actually what's already here. Reasonable is applicable in certain contexts, and actually I'd be arguing to shift to a broader set of relations where reasonableness is a good thing, is a daily practice, but that's not right now. And all of the arguments that are often mobilized in terms of being reasonable about things and being rational about things, are really only serving to dig us into a deeper hole as the unfolding of, um, a pretty horrific set of essentially fascistic uh, outcomes unfolds in real time. So I I don't have anything more than what I've said today as a way of trying to advocate for the fact that it's worth spending at least some time trying to do this truly oppositional work in some way, trying to find ways to make that real, however small. That's the point, because it doesn't have to be at scale. Um, but I do think it's uh, vital.
We might see the kind of community ice watch initiatives in Minneapolis as again, which had nothing, which involved whistles and coordination as an example of something one could do in these contexts. I want to thank you, Dan, for an incredibly thought-provoking, incisive, wide-ranging, and I think stimulating talk. I will be thinking about it. I teach an undergraduate class on AI social impacts. We've been reading your book. We are talking about regulation and governance on Monday, and I suspect several of my students have been in the audience, and I suspect they'll have things to say about that in that context. And yeah, on behalf of the Starling Center, I want to thank you. We've had a peak of 125 folks attending, plus another 22 at a watch party in the FIMS building at London, Ontario. And our dean Susa Kanabe messaged me to say that they all gave you a rousing round of applause as well. So thank you very much. Mandy, do you have anything to say on behalf of the Rogers Chair?
Uh, just thank you again, Dan, for such a great talk. It's been a really important contribution to a year of talks and activities focused on media, technology, and fascism. So we're really grateful that you could join us by Zoom. And and I imagine many of the people who attended today look forward to reading your book and future publications. So thanks for sharing your work with us.